Okay, we're going to hear next from Lois Tverberg, who first came to Israel in 1999 at the age of 32 on a biblical study tour with Ray Vanderline. Since then, she has visited Israel multiple times as a student of the land, literature, and language of the Bible. She started attending Narkey Street in 2001 while participating in a summer biblical Hebrew class of Randall Booth's Biblical Language Center. She has considered herself a part of the Narkey diaspora ever since, listening to Bible studies and sermons on the internet. Lois is an author and teacher who writes on the Jewish roots of Jesus. Her books include Sitting at the Feet of Rabbi Jesus and Walking in the Dust of Rabbi Jesus. She also runs En Gedi Resource Center, a biblical teaching site which she helped start with Bruce Okema. Welcome, Lois.
I would like to thank you all for the Lord has amply supplied me in cough drops, and it is sufficient, I think. So I will try to let you have the minimum of coughing in my presentation, but okay. Well, you folks are meditating on the life and the significance of Bob Lindsey from close up. And yet you're meeting a person who you've never met before who has been impacted. And in fact, my life has been changed by Bob Lindsey and his students. I'm sitting here with David Biven and Steve Notley, Randall Booth, and many other teachers who are his, you could say, intellectual children. And when we're sitting next to biological children, I have to say, thank you for loaning your father to us, because those years that you wish that you could have had him playing with you, he was playing with us, and he was growing up another generation along with you. So thank you for that. So I'm part of the ripples in the pond that have flowed outwards from Lindsey's life and love for others and his love for the scriptures. And I have kind of an interesting entree into this world that I think will be able to, if I can share some perspectives. One of the main point that I want to talk about today, the title of my chapter was The Most Important Thing I Learned from Lindsey. And what I'm going to talk about is the incredibly sophisticated and bold Jewish claims that Jesus made for being the Messiah. And that was just earth-shattering for me. And I'm going to get there, but I want to bring you around to tell you a little bit about why that's so important to me, too. So if I can share a little bit. Some of us, I've heard many stories, like for Jordash, have come from backgrounds where our family life has not encouraged any study, and so to hear somebody actually studying is so exciting. My own background, I'm sorry, excuse me. My grandparents were Lutheran missionaries. My father is a doctor. We have a fairly good intellectual background, and so I was very curious when I went to college to learn more about the New Testament documents. I had models of people who loved the Lord and loved to learn, and yet when I was in college, it was in the mid-'80s. We've been hearing from Halver, he was talking about the Jesus seminar and this radical skepticism. Well, the professors that I was studying with in college were of just that same variety. I went to a Lutheran college, and my professor, ironically, he had become quite well known for his paper. It was in BAR, saying that the God-fearers of Acts never existed. It was an entirely Lucan fabrication. So you can imagine, I come from I had gone through these classes, and growing up as a Christian, I said, well, I guess as an adult, this is how I have to approach the scriptures. And so what can you do but just take a couple steps back and say, well, let's not look so close. We can still sing songs and pray prayers, but don't look too closely with a critical eye. So that's where I come from. My brain just does not ever quit, and so I actually went into the sciences, and I have a PhD in biology. I got my PhD at University of Iowa, and I was teaching several years and doing research in the laboratory, and so I have much more of a science bent, and that actually was what was impacting me as I was hearing the Jerusalem School material at first. When I first encountered the Lindsey and his Talmudim perspective, it was when I was a college professor and I was teaching students doing research, and I had there was a speaker at our church. His name is Ray Vanderlaan. How many of you folks recognize? There aren't that many of you here, but Ray Vanderlaan has made videos and all sorts of things. He went to the Institute of Holy Land Studies, and so he was a huge fan of Jerusalem Perspective, Brad Young's books, and so I had never heard such a thing. And you can imagine with my professor, who thought Luke was a gifted, not scientist, but fabricator of evidence. He had no lack of love for Luke. And so you can imagine, I just could not figure out, how can the same data, as a scientist, you have the synoptic gospels here, how can I be hearing one set of data that is so upside down and opposite from, and these conclusions, Lucan priority, Matthean priority, how can this be? So this was what was going on. And then even more so was that Ray had a very strong sense of that the gospels actually were accurate, or that they were trustworthy historically, with some critical, you can use some critical senses, and yet you could believe that they were actually recording the historical context, and that just simply did not go together with what I had learned. And so, and even that Jesus was God's promised Messiah. Wait, really? So the scientist within me became very curious to understand, where was Ray getting this material and what was different about these folks. Not so much that I was going to instantly jump on their bandwagon, because maybe they had come up with some theory that just gave them an end run without actually using a critical analysis. Well, so I went to some classes with Ray, and we studied the Jerusalem Perspective articles, and then I signed up for 6 days, 11 hours a day with David Biven, a very long table, incredible, up to your eyeballs in books, and we did exactly the Jerusalem School kind of thing, the method. And then I got my closest taste of Bob Lindsey. And it was after about 5 hours of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and you can imagine some of us were glazing over a little bit. David Biven, here, David, can you come up here?
They don't know what Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are.
That's good, they shouldn't. I don't want them to. After your eyes had glazed thoroughly over, David would say, everybody get up. Okay, everybody get up.
Kumu, you have to say.
Can you show us? And then David would show us this exercise that Bob Lindsey used to do, and have us all do Bob Lindsey's exercise. Okay?
Okay. I do remember doing
Oh, golly, David.
No
golly,
dancing,
David.
this is a Baptist church.
Okay.
Stand over here, you guys. Stand over here. We were trying to simulate a teacher and his disciples of the first century. We even tried to have our total discussion in questions. The teacher would ask a question, the student would ask a question, and question, just like in the time of Yeshua. Just look at Jesus' teaching and see how many times he asked a question. Almost always it's in the form of a question. Well, we tried to do that. It didn't last very long. At the breaks, the big breaks, we'd go for a walk, and if the students could keep up from me, then we could have discussions as we walked. I was in the lead always, in good shape. But then what Lois was talking about is Lindsey's famous exercise, because he was missing part of a leg, so he couldn't do a lot of exercises. But this, he said, this is the one that will solve all of your problems, and you can do it with me.
Okay.
And he said it's all in the elbows. It's all in the elbows how you do this. So he taught.
Go ahead.
He taught me that you have to use your elbows as a fulcrum, I think he said. So it's hard at the beginning. You have to do it for a few weeks until it. No, I mean.
Without stopping.
No. And Bob would turn around, so you could see. And it really warms up your midriff.
Midriff area. There you go. Okay. There you go. Okay. Okay, that was just a little bit of foolishness, but now you've got a little taste of this experience. Some of you have experienced all of these Bob Lindsey things. That was my closest experience to Bob Lindsey, is, mind-numbing amount of information flowing at you and then doing jumping jacks and this kind of thing. But I have to say, about 4 days into it, all of that would start to gel, and the lights would come on, and do you remember, some of you recognize there's this story about Ben Zoma, who he was just on fire. He was so excited, and he was pouring it on, and the rabbinic story, it says that like flames of fire burst from him. I don't know whether he was just setting his audience on fire, but the other rabbi said, "What were you talking about in there?" And he says, "I was linking words of Torah and words of the prophets and words of the writings, and they burst into flames just as they were given on Mount Sinai. And were they not given in fire originally?" And so it would be about day 5 when you'd start having these words bursting into flames in front of us. And that was where I really got my start there. So now you've experienced a little bit of that. Okay. So And what, I'm coming back to what I was saying, as a scientist, I was still analyzing what is the difference in this methodology, and why is it that they are somehow coming to such a vastly different conclusion than the rest of the professors and analysts that are looking at the exact same texts. How can that be? We've already heard David say the key is to see the Hebrew behind the Gospels. There's one key, and then also to know Jesus' words within rabbinic literature. Well, for me, there is a third key that is, I'd call it a corollary to the other two, I never hear it mentioned, but I think it's really important. And it is that you need to appreciate the sophisticated knowledge they had of their scriptures, and which of course is the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and how they were perfectly comfortable pulling together passages in very sophisticated methods, and doing things like Gezerah, Shavah. I think folks here probably know what that means, where you take like Ve'ahavta from Leviticus 19 and from Deuteronomy 6. You put them right together, and your brain can do that. I read a fascinating chapter by E.P. Sanders about Paul. It was called Paul the Jew. And he wanted to share a controversial theory he had that was not being very well received. He, as a child, had, for fun, he really liked to learn long poems. He liked like epic poems. He would study them. And as he was thinking back on his experience as a child, he remembered his teachers didn't really, they would discourage it because they said, oh, it doesn't develop your mind. And yet he found that when he could remember these decades later, and he could also do a very sophisticated analysis of them. He'd see words in one place and words in the other, and then he'd sit there saying, it looks like Paul must have been doing something like this. And so he, at his scholarly meetings, would say, I think Paul knew his scriptures by memory. And it was a combination of Jews and Christians in the audience. The responses he got from the Christians were highly unlikely or totally impossible. The response he got from the Jewish scholars was, yes, of course he did, and what else did he know? And so shows a very different attitude. And the fact that Christians, even well-studied ones, we are not used to the thought or the idea of working with and dwelling in scriptures, being able to converse in them and then do these sophisticated things. To me, that as much as you might say it's important to learn Hebrew, a lot of people say, okay, or to learn about Judaism, that's a big step. But to be able to say, read that other chunk of the Bible that you never even looked at. Maybe not all of you went through that, but that's where I come from. That to me is more convicting, is that we have this big part of the Bible that the Torah and the prophets that Jesus knew intimately, that we are completely devoid of knowledge of. And that is a bigger problem and much more accessible to many people than the rest, even though they can keep working on it. Okay, so once you are aware of this tendency of Jesus, you find out that Jesus is using this technique to make powerful, incredibly important claims about himself. And that was, us ignorant scholars that don't realize that he is using his Bible in this way. When they look at the synoptics, they don't hear him saying, I am Messiah. They hear it throughout the rest of the New Testament. And so they say, well, obviously these are the ecclesiastical accretions of the later Greek church, and we need to peel them away to find the real Jewish Jesus. And what was so fascinating was that when Bob and David Flusser were studying together, they kept bumping into these very Jewish ways of saying incredibly potent things about being Messiah. For the sake of time, I'm going to only name them, and I think for most of you, if you've been here, you've heard sermons and sermons and sermons some more, so I don't really need to do a lot more than that. simply you need to start with the fact that anybody who is going to claim to be Messiah is not going to just wear a big T-shirt that says Messiah on it. Bar Kokhba, whose real name was Bar Kozba, he had, as his revolts had been, when they were successful, Rabbi Akiva gave him that, he had kind of morphed his name into Bar Kokhba, which is Aramaic, which means son of the star. And that to us still doesn't sound messianic, but if you are very aware of Numbers 24 and about, a star will come forth from Jacob and a scepter from Israel, son of a star sounds very messianic to you. And so every time he's being called that, it sounds messianic, but you have to be aware of that scripture. You also, and then he himself, on his coins, he wrote, Nasi Yisrael, Prince of Israel, which we'd say, well, is that messianic? Well, if you know Ezekiel 34, yes, there it is. I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will feed them. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. There it is. And so, it would have just rung in their ears. So it just needs to ring in our ears. I see. Okay. So you have heard about seemingly obscure things like Jesus talking about the breaker passage, the passage where that's right. Thank you. Where we talk about the kingdom bursting forth like violence, and that it's actually about it. God. It's the imagery from Micah 2:12 through 13 about this shepherd that's going to lead his flock forward. I know you have heard these things. I feel like I ought to go past these things because I know. So once again, these passages, Jesus is using them to speak about his message, his kingdom, and his role as a Messiah. Another one, which is also subtle, is the Zacchaeus passage, where after Zacchaeus repents of his sins, Jesus says, Micah, he says, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man has come to seek and save what was lost. And he is talking, he's using these epithets like Son of Man, which we tend to think of coming from Daniel 7, if you know Daniel 7, about this figure who is going to come at the end of time as a judge. And yet here he's proclaiming that Zacchaeus, this sinner, is now forgiven of his sins. You hear him picking these motifs that have different implications and then bringing them together. I'm going to just bring you to my last and to me most important place where I see this and just show you one place where I see him doing it that I've never heard anybody do before. That is the fact that I was talking about the Son of Man, who in Daniel 7 it says the one like the Son of Man he comes and he sits at the right hand of God, and the books are open to him in judgment. He's this figure of judgment. And then it says, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, and that all peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him, and his dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. You hear the kingdom being attached to judgment. And we wonder, how can, in many of the places where Jesus is talking about the Son of Man, he says things like that the Son of Man must suffer and be rejected. How can that be? Why would you find this? Well, I would like to go to, you notice at the end of this passage, after this judgment, you hear about the Son of Man being given kingdom and authority and dominion over all of the nations of the earth. That sounds very much like another messianic image in Psalm 2, where he is given, where God proclaims the Messiah his son, and he says, hang on. You are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give you the nations your inheritance, the very ends of the earth as your possession. You hear a different motif that's being attached to the Messiah being given possession of people and kingdom and authority. The final place where I find this most intriguing is a place I've never heard anybody talk about this. It is Isaiah 53. And I found it surprisingly in the JPS Tanakh, the Jewish Publication Society version. In verse 12, what I read in the NIV that might sound familiar to you, it says, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong. And it just sounds, go Jesus. He's a pretty strong guy because, he suffered and died for us. You've heard those lines before. But in the JPS version, listen to how powerful this line is. The way they translate it is, assuredly I will give him the many as his portion, and he shall receive the multitude as his spoil. The difference is between that he's being called great, or that he's actually receiving multitudes as his spoil. That line about suffering, you wouldn't think in this prophecy about suffering that you would have these imagery of being given vast kingdoms as a result of it. And yet, listen how close that is to Psalm 2, where it says, I will give you the nations as your inheritance and the ends of the earth as your possession. And you also hear that in Daniel 7, where after he sits down, he is given the kingdoms and dominions to judge. And I am going to, as a junior scholar and curious person, I'm going to give that as a gentle observation to be able to hand that up to my scholarly mentors and ask you to subject it to more rigorous examination. Would that be a possible way of understanding that? So I'm going to bring this all together. Thank you for your patience with my voice and my demeanor. But you can see that my own life, because of your patience with your father to let him minister to other people, has changed the way we look at Christ. We have been inspired to write books and tell our friends, our family. It is transformed the way we approach our scriptures because of Bob's interest in loving God with all his heart and embracing Jesus in his Jewish context. So thank you very much for your sharing him with us. Okay.
Thanks so much, Lois. I'm going to take some comments and questions, and let's hear from some of us who maybe haven't asked any questions yet, or we haven't heard from yet. I know sometimes some of us might need a little time to process and think of questions, and before some of the rest of us are really quick with being able to get a question out. So why don't you go ahead and think of something, some of you who haven't said anything yet. Okay, maybe some of you on the panel who want to answer Lois's question. And while you're thinking of an answer, I just want to say that I think it's really neat, Lois, that you've come from, you studied theology but then also went into biology, and so you've come from sort of different angles at this question, and I think precisely because you've come from different angles and from different fields, you've been able to make it so much more accessible to a wider audience, and are able to sort of consider how other people who aren't coming at it from a very specialized understanding, and that's just been a real asset to so many people, and I think it's really been a blessing. So I think that's great. So thank you for that. Does someone on the panel want to?
I can very briefly respond and say there is ambiguity in verse 12, and I like that reading. It's worth chewing over. The link with Psalm 2, very interesting. And I'll just add, we had talked about this on the car on the way in, and something we moderns are always raised with the idea that Psalm 53 within Jewish tradition is, I'm sorry, Psalm 53. That too is a good psalm, but Isaiah 53, thank you. We're raised thinking Isaiah 53 in Jewish tradition is non-messianic, but in the Targum it says right at the very beginning, my servant Malka Meshiach, King Messiah. And so that's part of the Jewish tradition. And anyway, this having the nations as part of the Messiah's inheritance, I like the link. That isn't a final judgment. I'm just saying there's ambiguity. I like it.
Great, thanks. We have a question here.
You have to come to you.
Hi, I have a question regarding maybe just your comments on when Yeshua, when he was dealing with his messianic claims. Mm-hmm. It really depends on who he's speaking to. Apparently, it seems that when he speaks to Gentiles, he will say, go and proclaim that I'm the Messiah, something like that. But when it comes to Jews, he will kind of like not tell them a direct way. He will kind of like tell them not to proclaim, just keep it down. Like, have you read that? I mean, and if you have you? I've also heard someone say about the hidden face of the Messiah, like he hides it. If you could comment on that, that'd be great.
It's one of those big questions that I guess I would say that it isn't as easy as slicing that Jesus has. You're right. I completely agree with you that depending on the situation, he responds in different ways to different audiences. I wouldn't quite divide it between Jews and Gentiles, although part of the reason why we see that is we hear it more in John's gospel, where John puts in more discussions between Gentiles, and then John also tends to, because he's writing for a more Gentile audience, you tend to hear Jesus in these Jewish passages where Jesus will say something like, the Son of Man has come to seek and save the lost. You can hear these sophisticated veiled references to being the shepherd. The shepherd. But in John, he just says, I am the good shepherd. And John just spells it right on out for you in order to translate it culturally, because the Gentiles are not going to get the point in the sophistication of how Jesus is speaking to the Jews. I don't think that he is veiling it as much as he is simply explaining it at a much higher level, and then it wouldn't have made sense to Gentiles anyhow. So, okay.
This question always gets me on the barricades
Okay, good.
because of so much nonsense that has been written about the messianic secret. That
yeah,
Jesus
thank
didn't really know who he was, and that's why you got the gospel writers saying don't tell and all this. Jesus is always trying to reveal himself. Always. He came down out of Nazareth, out of obscurity, into a town of Capernaum where there's not just agriculture, but there's trade and fishing. He's coming deliberately into the public eye, and he's always trying to reveal himself. But he wants people to know who he really is, so he does block misunderstanding. And we all know that what Pilate feared was that he was king of the Jews. And Jesus, the victim, manipulates the conversation until Pilate says, so you're the king of the Jews? And all Jesus has to say is, you just said it. Or he manipulates the conversation with the high priest who said, oh, so you're the Son of God? You just said it. So that's the Jewish part, that if I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. There's somebody else who bears witness of me. So he blocks the misunderstandings because he knows there's too many people among his own people who want him to stand up and kick the Romans out. And he had a much more difficult kingdom in mind, a kingdom of not coercion, all of our human kingdoms, armies, secret police, murder, kill the opposition. Even Solomon, David's dying advice was, kill Joab. Now, the first thing Jesus did when he was crowned in Jerusalem was let the opposition kill him. That's confidence in your kingdom, in your rule. So this difference between a kingdom of coercion, the misunderstanding that his people had, stand up, lead us, give us victory, he had a more difficult kingdom of persuasion in mind. So that's one of my pet peeves, is this messianic secret nonsense.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Howard.
Tell us what you really think.
There you go. That's it.
Thank you for that vibrantly delivered note of clarity.
Can I add one last? This is my. I'm going to, as I leave this discussion about Isaiah 53 to the scholars, I have to point out the one verse I should have pointed out that I did not, and it is in Luke 22 during the Last Supper, where it says, "You are those who have stayed with me in my trials, and I apportion to you." It's I covenantally grant to you, as my Father assigned to me a kingdom. He's using the same language as in Isaiah 53, whereas God says, I will apportion to him the multitudes. And so you hear in Luke at the Last Supper, he's speaking about just as he suffered on behalf of his people and is being rewarded. He is purchasing for himself a kingdom. It's being apportioned to him as an inheritance. He is now apportioning it to the strong. It sounds like Isaiah 53:12 here to me. So there you go.
Thanks, Lois.